Good evening. I'm Larry Hurtado, Emeritus Professor of New Testament Language, Literature, and Theology, and a member of the Gifford Lectures Committee. And I'm pleased and delighted to welcome and host tonight our distinguished speaker, Professor Agustín Fuentes, the Edmund P. Joyce Professor of Anthropology at the University of Notre Dame, as he continues in his series entitled Why We Believe: Evolution, Making Meaning, and the Development of Human Natures. And this evening, Professor Fuentes will deliver his second lecture entitled What Makes Us Human? The Constitution of the Human Niche and the Capacity for Belief. Now, this lecture and all the lectures will be recorded, and the video of this lecture will shortly be available online on the university's Gifford Lectures web pages. The URL is in your brochure on the back page of your brochure. And I can say that last night's lecture is already up and available for viewing. We also want to encourage people to not only view the lectures or review them and think them over, but of course remember the blog site that's there as well, which is available for comments and questions. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand you over to Professor Agustín Fuentes. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks again to the Gifford Committee and to all of you for braving a cold and wintry evening to come out and listen to a discussion about the construction of the human niche and the capacity for belief. Approximately 2 million years ago, our ancestors endeavored to succeed in a landscape replete with a multitude of large predators, a myriad of competitors for food and shelter. They were medium-sized, hairless, fangless, hornless, clawless, bipedal, ape-like beings, armed with a few rocks and some sticks. Yet they survived, changed, expanded, and eventually became us, one of the most widespread and significant species on the planet. And in this history, in this process, lies a key to the answer of why we believe. How did our ancestors succeed? In a nutshell, they cooperated, innovated, created, imagined, and eventually believed. They became human. And in the process, constructed and were shaped by a dynamic new niche, a new way of becoming in the world. In order to understand why we believe, we must delve into this distinctive and really quite fantastic evolutionary history. Humans are mammals and primates and hominins, but we're also something distinct from all of those categories. Humans can philosophize about our place in the world and share it with one another. We can experience existential crises, and we regularly assume some aspects of life include a transcendent component. So, obviously, even an evolutionary explanation of what makes us human must have some connection to these distinctive facts of humanity. Such considerations are the mainstays of most philosophical and theological explanations, but most evolutionary explanations draw on different sources of knowledge. An evolutionary description of distinction has to be measurable or otherwise discretely identifiable as a set of parameters that classify one cluster of beings as opposed to another. So, what does make us human in an evolutionary sense? Many would suggest it is that we are a species. Species definitions separate organisms by shape, size, genetic sequence, and other variables that arise during their evolutionary histories. There are constellations of morphological and genetic measurements that identify that you or I are human and not a porpoise or a chimpanzee or an elephant. But what makes us human, even evolutionarily, is more than a constellation of morphological and genetic traits. We, all of life, are not just museum specimens to be measured and cataloged. Measuring an eagle's wings, its head and its talons, allows one to differentiate it from a sparrow or an ostrich or a flamingo. But such an approach does not tell you what makes an eagle, what it is to be the eagle for the eagle itself. Living organisms are not static assemblages of traits. They do things in the world. And those things are not universally reducible to morphological or genetic traits. What organisms do is a critical part of the definition of who they are. So, in an evolutionary definition, needs to encompass not just an organism's materiality, its morphology and genetics, but also its behavior, its way of relating to the world. Given that, we could say that humans give birth to live young with extended childhoods. We're very complex growing up. We have very large brains. Our societies are complex, and they vary from space to space, population to population. We, as organisms, have very different ways of doing things. That could be the definition of the human. But what I've just described actually describes gorillas and even blue whales. No, to understand from an evolutionary perspective what makes a particular kind of organism distinctive, what makes it, we need to know not just its form and some details of its behavior, but also the way it exists in and with the world. Or, to paraphrase the anthropologist Tim Ingold, we need to know how it becomes. We need to be able to describe the Umwelt, the way an organism perceives and experiences the world. The philosopher, semiotician, and biologist Jacob van Uxkal illustrates this approach by considering the Umwelt, the life world of the tick. And here I read from van Uxkal. From the egg there issues forth a small animal, not yet fully developed, for it lacks a pair of legs and sex organs. In this state, it is already capable of attacking cold-blooded animals, such as lizards, whom it waylays as it sits atop the tip of a blade of grass. After shedding its skin several times, it acquires the missing organs, mates, and starts its hunt for warm-blooded animals. After mating, the female climbs to the tip of a twig on some bush. There she clings at such a height that she can drop upon small mammals that may run under her or be brushed off by larger animals. The eyeless tick is directed to this watchtower by a general photosensitivity of her skin. The approaching prey is revealed to the blind and deaf highwaywoman by her sense of smell. The odor of butyric acid that emanates from the skin glands of all mammals acts on the tick as a signal to leave her watchtower and hurl herself downwards. If, in doing so, she lands on something warm, a fine sense of temperature betrays this to her. She has reached her prey, the warm-blooded creature. It only remains for her to find a hairless spot. There she burrows deep into the skin of her prey and slowly pumps herself full of warm blood. The tick's abundant blood repast is also her last meal. Now, there is nothing left for her to do but to drop to earth, lay her eggs, and die. The blind, deaf, teeny tick is a living, perceiving, acting, and reacting to the world as an organism in particular and distinctive ways. Contemporary ecological and evolutionary parlance calls this a niche. Its description, scientifically, of the Umwelt of the organism. Niches are dynamic, not static, and they are the nexus of any evolutionary story. If we're to seek a comprehensive and effective evolutionary answer to the question of what makes us human, we need more than just measures of our bodies and behaviors. We need to understand the structure and dynamics of a human niche, a niche that involves the development of a capacity for and the practice of belief. Today, the human niche can be best envisioned as the spatial, ecological, and social sphere that includes all social partners, perceptual contexts, and ecologies of human individuals, groups, and communities, and the many other species that share space and place alongside humans. The human niche is the context for the lived experience of humans and their communities. It's where we share social and ecological histories, as well as where the creation of and participation in shared knowledge, social and structural security, and development across the lifespan occurs. But for humans, the niches we occupy, structure, and interact with are also include the perceptual context of humans and communities, the ways in which the structural and social relationships are perceived and expressed via behavioral, symbolic, and material aspects of the human experience. The anthropologist Terry Deacon offers us a valuable characterization of this key facet of the human niche when he describes it as the great ubiquitous semiotic ecosystem in which we develop. The contemporary human niche is simultaneously ecological, material, imagined, perceived, and constructed. In this niche, meaning matters and is evolutionarily relevant. The anthropologist Polly Weissner and I recently offered an overview of what this human niche might look like in the context of a von Uexkelian Umwelt. And here I read again the quote. For the human niche, the human Umwelt. A fetus is formed via the interactions between genes and developmental processes, laying the baseline for body and behavior. In the womb, it is exposed to environmental factors, such as diet and stress, that shape its development and can set off epigenetic change. After birth, an infant may be strapped to a cradle board, cuddled by a father, or nursed by a number of caretakers, with an impact on the physiology of both caretaker and infant. From early on, children have the dispositions to charm investment from community members and acquire the roles and rules of society. They begin to embody the skills to negotiate challenging physical and social terrain. Even basic perceptions, such as smell and color, are mutually shaped physiology and cultural experience. Growth and maturity are often ushered in by complex rites of passage, with social selection pressures shaping reproductive chances and outcomes, and what those processes mean to the individual and the society. Humans develop in community. Adults carry out economic enterprises in roles built over generations of history. They acquire ideological outlooks that guide their motivations, goals, and loyalties. Humans learn the rules of cultural institutions, while individual agents push the limits, bringing about game changes that alter the social structures and make history. Given the vast complexity of the interlacing biological, social, and cultural forces, arriving at an effective understanding of the human niche is truly daunting, especially as we know that in contemporary evolutionary theory, simplistic, reductionistic, or linear notions of what organisms are and explanations for what they do are insufficient. The biologist Kevin Leyland of St. Andrews, just up the road from here, and his colleagues perfectly summarize contemporary evolutionary understandings in the following quote. Organisms are constructed in development, not simply programmed to develop by genes. Living things do not evolve to fit into pre-existing environments, but co-construct and co-evolve with their environments, in the process changing the structures of ecosystems. If what makes us human is in part creating, occupying, and modifying the human niche, and co-constructing and co-evolving with it, then a large part of the answer to what makes us human, and therefore a substantive component of why we believe, lies in the patterns and events that characterize this process across the longue durée of human evolution. The available data make it abundantly clear that over the last 2 million years, the human lineage underwent specific morphological changes alongside less easily measurable but significant behavioral and cognitive shifts as it forged and was shaped by a new niche, a human niche. Our lineage is descendant from a small group of fangless, clawless, naked bipedal, ape-like hominins who were able to transmit into organisms that could see in stone the potential for tools, who moved through these tools, manipulating their environment and their ecologies, developing new ways to think and see of the world that led them to paint pictures on cave walls and imagine new possibilities, which led to more constructions, interactions, and growth, to the development of cities, and finally, ultimately, to our becoming one, or maybe the, principal force in the global ecosystem. The capacity for belief emerged during the evolution of the human niche. The development of the human niche is a process of changing bodies, minds, and lives of not just the members of the genus Homo, but also of our more distant ancestors. The material record reveals increasing brain sizes and a myriad of skulls, legs, feet, and other material elements of bodies and lives as they changed across evolutionary time, and it has much to tell us. As I said in the first lecture, we can go back 5-6 million years and find the earliest hominins and understand a little from them, and then we see about 3 to 4 million years ago this great radiation of forms in this area, which gives rise to a particular lineage, our lineage, the lineage of the genus Homo. Other lineages existed, but they all go extinct by about 1.2 million years ago, which leaves our lineage Homo, which diversifies and spreads around the planet into multitudes of populations and morphologies and actions. But all of those forms, all of those populations either go extinct or meld, leaving only us. We are the last hominin standing. The vast majority of our history, for the vast majority of our history, the overall number of individuals in our lineage on the planet was fairly low. And it's hypothesized that most populations were not in regular contact with more than a few others. We know that different populations did interbreed, at least a little, and that most populations eventually went extinct. Starting about 300 to 400,000 years ago, we begin to see greater evidence of more frequent connections between populations and regions, a scenario that expands greatly in the last 100,000 years. We also know that between about 300,000 years and 100,000 years or so, most populations begin to have the morphotype, the bodies that look just like we do today. And by 25,000 years ago, all humans look like what we call today Homo sapiens sapiens. In fact, if you were to take all humans today and compare them, we find a range of morphological variation, but an incredible genetic homogeneity. If you take any two humans on the planet from anywhere and compare them, and you take any two chimpanzees from their range across Central Africa and compare them, the chimpanzees will have much more genetic difference than any two of the humans. Actually, if you took a white-tailed deer from the Midwestern United States and a white-tailed deer from the Southeastern United States, they will have more genetic differences between them than any two humans across the entire planet. How we became such a widely distributed species and yet maintained such homogeneity in capacities and genetics is a critical outcome of the human niche. But bodies and genes are not all that matter in this narrative. Our success is linked directly to the emergence and development of a distinctive human niche, a novel Umwelt in which the capacity for belief emerges, and we have material evidence for many of the major landmarks in this development. You may or may not be able to read it in the back here, but what we have here is 2 million years of evolutionary history of the genus Homo. The human niche develops slowly at first with some stone tools, a little bit of brain increase changes, certain types of behaviors that we find material evidence for, and then begins to pick up pace dramatically 300,000 to 400,000 years ago and expands again about 125,000 years ago and explodes in the last 12,000 years or so. We're not going to worry about what to call all the different populations of members of the genus Homo in this story, because it is the interactions with the niche, the co-construction, that truly matters. This dynamic mode of becoming forms a central core for our capacity for being human, for creating, for destroying, for imagining, and for believing. For the purpose of this lecture, we're going to divide this key phase, the construction of the human niche, into two basic parts. The initiation of the human niche, which is going to be this first initial part, and then the construction, but not completion, of the human niche, which will be the last million years or so. And remember, Kevin Leyland and colleagues reminded us organisms are constructed in development, not simply programmed to develop by genes. Living things co-construct and co-evolve with their environments, in the process changing the structure of ecosystems. Thus, the challenge we face in examining human evolution is to identify the critical aspects that facilitated the specific co-construction and co-evolution of these traits across time, and bodies and ecologies with them that enabled the development of the contemporary human niche, and with it, the capacity to believe. Unfortunately, this is really very complicated. We know that it was a series of feedback loops, interfaces, and dynamics across multiple systems that enabled this to happen. Luckily, some of my colleagues, brilliant archaeologists, Fiona Coward and Matt Grove, have created a diagram to illustrate this connectivity for us. Don't worry, there will not be exam after the lecture. What we know and what is listed here is all of the variables of behavior, physiology, morphology, neurobiology, and genomic processes that we can measurably identify as part of the feedback processes in the human niche. But for our purposes, for this narrative today, we're only going to focus on a few of these key patterns, the ones that a vast majority of researchers agree played critical roles in the initiation and construction of the human niche. Just don't forget how complex all of this is. Our niche's initiation lies at the heart of a story of interconnectivity between foraging and nutrition, brains and bodies, caring for young, avoiding predators, and making stone tools in the time period between roughly 2.3 and 1 million years ago. The earliest members of our genus walked on 2 legs, had longer arms and fingers than we do, a remnant of our recent ancestors' continued use of the trees, but their hands were sufficiently like ours to have a fine motor grip and substantial manual dexterity. From quite early on, our ancestors diverged, even if slightly, from the other hominins. Their brains were a bit larger, and their capacity for making stone tools a bit more complex. This is an Oldowan stone tool. Now, I understand that most of you are probably not impressed by this. It's a rock with sharp edges. But you should be. This is a unique capacity that only our lineage mastered. Making stone tools involves not only the capacity to envision alternative and usual shapes in a stone, but to develop and share processes for creating those shapes via modifying the stone, teaching and learning. And not just any stones. There's good evidence for the collection of certain types of rocks and their transport up to 5 to 10 kilometers as early as 1.8 million years ago. This tool-making capacity, including the source selection and the sharing of the manufacturing techniques, was likely due to a suite of social learning processes more intensive in our lineage than we see in any other animals. These early members of our genus, like the other hominins and similar-sized mammals around them, were also prime targets for a myriad of large predators that covered the grasslands and forests of eastern and southern Africa. There were 16 large carnivores in eastern Africa that stood 1.5 meters tall or larger. We have substantial evidence that our ancestors were indeed preyed upon by numerous predators. This skullcap is a good example of that, with the reconstruction just to the right of it. Predation was a problem, but over time we see a reduction in the fossils of our lineage that have clear evidence of predation. This is a problem they appear to have tackled and at least partially solved, likely by making themselves a less ideal target. This was due to their applying their expanding capacities for better quality social communication and coordination to efforts of predicting and avoiding predator movements. Such actions made them less attractive to predators compared with other prey options. Our ancestors deployed their augmented social and communication skills not just towards shaping stones into tools, but also into reshaping the predation pressures affecting them. This highly social, communicative behavioral suite led to increased capacities for coordination and also eventually enabled groups of Homo to scavenge predator kills more effectively, augmenting the amount of animal protein in their diet. Building on this, they began to expand their foraging patterns and enhance nutrition returns even further. By just under 2 million years ago, we see evidence that they were starting to mix in aquatic resources. These are bones from catfish and turtles dating to 1.76 million years ago. They were also using underground storage organs of plants, roots, and tubers, and in both cases, they were using tools to extract, manipulate, and consume these resources. At the heart of the early Homo success was a mixed reliance not just on their bodily capacities and social cohesion, as most primates do, but also on their capacity to innovate behaviorally in complex ways, new stone toolmaking, predator avoidance, dietary resource expansion, and to share those practices with one another. Our lineage developed a level of social learning, a cooperative and collaborative intensity of information transfer greater than in any other primates or any other hominins. This was the initiation of the human niche, and it focused on increased cooperation and communication, more collaborative social learning, and sharing of information. And it opened the doors to more flexible development and social systems. Here, two critical changes began to occur. First, as social lives became more complex, the amount of time it took young members of the genus Homo to acquire sufficient information on how to become an effective member of the genus Homo lengthened. Second, as the diversity and quality of diets increased, the actual macro and micronutrient profiles went up, adding more energy into the system, into their bodies. Combining these two patterns enabled our ancestors to evolve a lengthening of the maturation process, facilitating longer brain growth. Today, humans are born with brains only about 25% of their final size. 70 to 75% of final brain growth occurs after birth. That's almost double or more any other organism. There is more neurological development after birth, and this creates more learning capacity and expanded neuroplasticity. This critically important extended childhood period begins early in our lineage, probably between 1.5 and 1.7 million years ago. But the costs of having a very dependent offspring become even more dependent, and for a longer period of time, places extraordinary pressure on the mother. Our ancestors capitalized on a component of their emerging niche to address this challenge: increased cooperation and social coordination. Humans became cooperative caretakers of the young. How this pattern emerged was brilliantly assessed by the anthropologist Sarah Hrdy and subsequently effectively modeled and described by many other researchers. Behaviorally at first, then followed by changes to the physiology of bodies, our ancestors developed a system of cooperative care for the young, lessening the specific burden on the mother and expanding the social landscape and learning possibilities for our lineage. To summarize, the initiation of the human niche emerged from the interfaces of physical, ecological, and behavioral mutual reshaping. These processes came about when a tool-making hominin with increased social, collaborative, and communicative skills began to diversify their diets, reduce the pressures of predation on themselves, and work together to care for and socially inculcate young in more intensive and information-rich manners. Through the process of its initiation, ours is a thoroughly social and cooperative niche linked to augmented capacities to collaborate, to share information, to rely on the manipulation of materials outside our bodies, and to create new solutions to the challenges of the world. Between about 1.8 million and 100,000 years ago, our lineage, the genus Homo, spread across much of Africa, Eurasia, East and Southeast Asia. By 70,000 years ago, we had reached Australia. By 15 to 20,000 years ago, we had moved into the Americas. And by 2,000 years ago, humans had populated the islands of the Pacific. Across this time period, we see evidence of the expansion and expanded construction of the human niche ecologically, behaviorally, and technologically. Core aspects of this construction of the human niche included the interrelations between and innovations in movement and connections between groups, new patterns of foraging, the acquisition and use of fire, meaning-making, and of course, increasingly complex tools. All of these factors had a role in shaping Homo cognition and social organization, constructing the human niche, building the infrastructure for our capacity to believe. Now, here's a tool that you should be impressed by. I hope you are. A novel type of stone tool technology shows up about 1.5 million years ago or so, and we call this the Acheulean. Between about 1.5 million and 400,000 years ago, it becomes increasingly complex. It's generally divided into two phases, an early and a late phase. This stone tool technology, making this tool, requires substantially more training, teaching, and learning to produce. The Acheulean tools are more complex in their structure, refined in their form and usage, and they enable an even wider array of food processing and material manipulation than the earlier forms of stone tools do. Interestingly, by about 500,000 years ago, we find that many of this classic form of a Acheulean tool, called a hand axe, they're being worked and crafted to a level of symmetry that is way beyond what's necessary for function. Almost as if the makers, our ancestors, were making an aesthetic choice. There's also evidence these tools are showing up in clusters across the landscape, as if they were made and cached, or possibly as if they were being used as markers of some geographic or cultural meaning. Acheulean tools were both functional tools used to tackle the challenges of the world, and they were imaginatively created materials that said something about and for those that made them. Recent work by a number of scholars demonstrates that this creativity in stone tool production has a broad impact for the capacity for flexibility in behavior, diet, and habitat manipulation. But it also affects the way neurobiology functions. Recent work by Dietrich Stout at Emory and by a group at St. Andrews and other colleagues has demonstrated through innovative experiments that the process of making these tools, which involves learning, teaching, observing, impacts and stimulates particular areas in the brain, causing novel neurobiological connectivity in areas that eventually become co-opted for particular modes of planning and for language. In fact, it is argued that this intensive investment in teaching, learning, and constructing of these tools is what led to a restructuring of our brains to develop the cognitive system that the neurobiologist Michael Arbib calls the language-ready brain, that the development of tools predisposed humans to acquire language. By 200 to 400,000 years ago, the toolkits have become even more diverse, and they start to take on regionally distinctive structural variation. There's evidence for the development and use of tools for large game hunting, and a wider range of materials used as tools, wood, bone, other things. And the pace of change continues to increase significantly relative to previous time periods. We also start to see clear evidence of composite tools, that is, two or more tools joined together to make a new form. By this time, the archaeological evidence indicates that the genus Homo, our lineage, is locked into a lifeway that ubiquitously involves extensive collection and deployment of materials that we shape, meld to our desires, and use to alter the world. Homo cognition and action are extended into the world by expanding the capacities and confines of our own bodies. The human Umwelt, our niche, becomes cyborg, deep, deep in our past, well before artificial limbs and iPhones. It's around this time that we also start to see stones and other material being transported across much longer distances than in the past, tens of kilometers, even hundreds of kilometers, indicating that, at least in some places, trade or forms of exchanges between relatively distant populations are starting to emerge. There is also recently genetic evidence that such exchanges and connections were becoming more common. The DNA doesn't tell us everything, but it does tell us an interesting story of what might have happened when two groups came together. The contemporary patterns of deep interconnectedness, an exchange of ideas between human groups across space, critical for the later development of belief systems, begins to emerge in this time period between 200 and 400,000 years ago. While cooperative parenting was initiated earlier in our lineage history, the behavioral and hormonal and neurobiological correlates and infrastructure for extended care enabled the development of patterns of heightened compassion and caretaking as a component of the human niche in this time period, across the construction of the human niche. The archaeologist Penny Spickens and her colleagues have demonstrated a wide range of fossil evidence for care of elderly, injured, and infirm individuals. Now, this is not to say that Homo in the same time period didn't run around killing each other. Right? We do have evidence of what appear to be lethal injuries caused by other Homo in the fossil records. However, the instances and evidence of compassion and caretaking are more frequent and more striking. You have two examples here. There's an aged, toothless individual, and then a young child with a severe cranial deformity. In both cases, each lived years after they could no longer fend or forage for themselves. Aged individuals with no teeth, injuries, disabled individuals, young with severe developmental diseases, and individuals who suffered traumatic injury, all helped by others to heal and live. No other species, to our knowledge, exhibits such a consistent pattern of care for others who are injured or ill or aged. This capacity and its use is argued to be one of the key reasons why members of our genus were able to spread so widely across so many new environments and collaborate so effectively as to develop a range of novel ways of reshaping the world around them. Compassion became a central feature of the human niche. Now, let me point out, cruelty can also be a central feature of the human niche, and that whole theme is coming to the fore in the next lecture. One of the most critical factors, and again, remember, I'm just highlighting the key factors that we can clearly say affected the construction of the human niche. Another of these critical factors is, of course, fire. The recognition of the power of fire and the eventual mastery of creating it, moving it, and using it changed the entire human niche. There's contention about when the first populations began to master fire. Some people say it's as much as 1 million years ago. Others say it's much more recent. The data are equivocal. But there is no debating that by 200 to 400,000 years ago, we find evidence of consistent use of fire. What does fire allow humans to do? It allows us to change night to day, to radically alter our activity patterns. It allows us to take meat and to change beef to filet mignon. It allows us to alter the chemical structure of plants and animals, of stones and wood, to recreate them and reshape them in even more refined manners. Being able to heat stone and wood to alter their structures and capacities, being able to use fire to combat, displace, and control other animals, and modify the landscape in which they lived, changed the human niche. Fire as a tool, fire as light, fire as external source of heat, reshaped our niche and opened up new pathways and opportunities for social and cognitive interactions, inspiration for the imagination, and expansion into and manipulation of the world. Not surprisingly, at the same time that I've been highlighting all of these, and now when I say same time, I'm talking about a 200 to 300 year time frame, 200 to 300,000 year time frame. At the same time period, we also see one of the last and most important innovations: increasing material evidence for the creation and use of materials that have meaning based on some shared ideology, assumption, imaginations that are not necessarily tied to the material features or qualities of the items themselves. The creation of what many like to call symbol or art. The biological anthropologist Mark Kissel and I recently compiled and published the largest database of all existing potentially symbolic or meaning-laden artifacts in the early archaeological record. These range from vaguely human-shaped modified stones and evidence of lines and simple geometric designs etched into shells and bones, to the manipulation of minerals that can be used as pigments and glues, to evidence of the creation of items of personal adornment, such as beads and the use of paints on bodies and tools. Over the most recent 300 to 400,000 years of our history, the human niche developed and expanded the realm of imagination and creativity across populations and groups of the genus Homo, making meaning, altering the world not just to serve specific functional ends, but to represent shared ideas and imaginaries became a central feature of daily lives. As the anthropologist Terry Deacon suggests, this is when our lineage solidified its niche as situated firmly in a ubiquitous semiotic ecosystem. Nothing in the human niche is without meaning, and most of that meaning is created, or at least modified, by the humans themselves. You can see how this is critical infrastructure for our capacity to believe. While we cannot know what many of these artifacts meant to the populations that made them, we can, through our own contemporary filters, identify specific categories of potential meaning. For example, in the last 300,000 years of the history of our genus, there are 3 patterns imbued with meaning that emerge and become more and more commonplace: burials, the creation of figurines, and image-based art, the details of which we will delve into and elaborate on in the 5th lecture. Since the early days of the genus Homo, behaviors, processes, changes, and actions were ongoing in a creative dynamic, eventually constructing a distinctive niche, a wholly human Umwelt, which involved the augmentation of the capacity for imagination, innovation, teaching and learning, caring and communicating, even conflicting. This niche opened new horizons and structures neurobiologically, ecologically, and behaviorally, which laid the groundwork for the contemporary human capacity for and practice of belief. Traveling at such breakneck pace through nearly 2 million years of our own history is daunting, and I do not blame you if you all have cognitive whiplash. But I hope it has been both an informational and enjoyable journey. Evolutionary histories are always complicated for all organisms, but ours is especially so. No matter how many times I immerse myself in the study of our lineage, I'm constantly and consistently amazed at our story. For the sake of clarity and continuity, let me circle back around to the point of these lectures and draw together the core processes that emerged as part of the human niche, as it developed across the last 2 million years, and relate them to why we believe. First, the patterns and processes of social cognition, the human perceptual landscape, emerged from the behavioral and neurobiological plasticity and capacity generated by and generating of feedback processes between tool-making, foraging, caretaking, the control of fire, the creation of symbolic materials, and the ecological expansion of humans across the planet. That ongoing dynamic set up the necessary biological, social, and ecological infrastructure for a capacity for belief. Second, the ratcheting up of human material, social, and ecological complexity, including enhanced compassion, combined with increased interactions between populations across the last few 100,000 years of our history, set up the critical material and demographic infrastructure necessary for the development of particular kinds of ecologies and societies that enabled shared beliefs and eventually belief systems to emerge. Finally, over the past few 100,000 years, material evidence demonstrates an increase in and eventual ubiquity of meaning-making, material and social, in which the human niche is infused with a capacity for imagination and innovation. This leads us to infer the emergence of 2 significant patterns. First is the ubiquity of imagining novel items, representations, and materials, and either making them or altering other things to become them. This is a capacity present in limited form in other animals, but one that becomes permanently and ubiquitously part of the human niche. Second, and drawing on the first, it is likely by the last 200,000 to 300,000 years of our history, humans developed the capacity for creating explanations of observable phenomena, such as death, the behavior of other animals, weather, the sun, and the moon. These explanations were shared and connected to aspects of the material world, but not confined to them. For example, humans did not just connect clouds, thunder, rain, and floods. They also, at least eventually, developed explanations for why they happen. While this topic will be treated in more depth in the 4th and 5th lectures, I want to note that this is exactly what the anthropologist Maurice Bloch means when he asserts that over evolutionary time, humans went from being socially complex transactional beings, as are most social mammals, to groups of organisms who exist simultaneously in both transactional and transcendent realities, and who use imagination and belief to reshape themselves and the world around them. The biological anthropologist Ashley Montagu encapsulates this core facet of the human niche, and here I paraphrase his famous quote. The environment humans make for themselves is created through their symbol-using ability, their capacity for abstraction. The symbols, the ideas are created in the mind, but the human animal learns not only to create them, but to project them onto the external world and there transform them into reality. And this we do via belief. Now, let me be absolutely clear. The capacity for belief is not simply an emergent property of humanity or something ephemerally floating above the material reality of the human. The ability to believe is part of the human system in equivalent manner that fingers are part of our arms and hands. Fingers are core aspects of the human modified over evolutionary time as to dramatically expand the options for our interface with the world and with each other. Fingers and the human hand are part of our arms. The material of the limbs has been modified, shaped, and altered over evolutionary time such that their terminal ends contain structures and capacities which enable them to do much more than they could without such components. Our capacity for belief is akin to our fingers and hand, both core aspects of the human, both critical in the human ability to engage with and shape the world, to become in the human niche. By 25,000 years ago, the human niche was well constructed and composed of all that we've covered here today. However, some critical structural, ecological, and perceptual aspects, factors affecting how and why we believe as contemporary humans, had not yet fully emerged. These are domestication, communal architecture, larger and larger communities, and changing notions of identities, politics, and economics. And along with those factors came the emergence of property and inequality, and of course, large-scale lethal violence, what we call warfare. These elements initiated more diverse relations, more types of conflict, and greater examples of coordination and cooperation. And they set the stage for contemporary human beliefs and belief systems. And we'll tackle that part of our story in the next lecture. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much again this evening. I wondered whether you agree that one of the things that seems to stand out about the human niche as compared to the niche of another organism is its instability across time and how much it's changed very quickly and how we've had to adapt quite quickly to those changes, even if we've caused them ourselves. Do you think that that's the case? And also, do you think that might be something that would impact a need for abstract thought explanations and therefore a belief system later on?
Yes and no. That's actually a very good question, because in a broader context, something that I didn't present here that is actually quite interesting. So remember I presented sort of that there were a bunch of other lineage of hominins, not our lineage, and they go extinct by about 1.2 million years ago. What we see in that time period of the last 4 million years is that climatic fluctuations go from this to this. And our lineage did much better as climates became less and less predictable because of our plasticity and our ability to navigate different ecologies through behavioral, cognitive responses. We seem to have a broader plasticity. So in one sense, yes, the instability of the niche, much of which is our own doing, especially today, is something that pushes our evolutionary processes. The flip side, though, is the incredible consistency, the homogeneity of these iterative processes, these reciprocal causative processes that enable humans to sort of deal with those things. So our incredible genetic homogeneity as a species and the incredible homogeneity overall of neurobiological function. Now, individually, interindividually, we vary in enormous ways in what we do and what we can learn and how we do in different situations. But as a species, our neurobiology is incredibly attuned to a common pattern. And so you could say that it is the hyperinstability and incredible stability simultaneously pushing each other that underscores the dynamics of the human niche. And especially for those of us trying to do modeling of these things, it's incredibly frustrating because there are really no good models for even just the brain. But then when we expand that to the human niche, it becomes incredibly dynamic as to we don't have right analytical toolkit yet to do those kinds of models effectively, as you saw from the slide of Fiona Coward and Matt Grove.
I'm really interested in how humans make manifest. Is this still on? How humans make manifest their beliefs through the tools that they have at hand. And I would like you to comment further on how our altered world establishes a bit of a feedback loop and gives rise to novel beliefs. Like, for example, what fire may have particularly given rise to, and how beliefs may regulate the use of particular tools as well.
No, and that's really, that is a theme that's going to be ramped up in each lecture moving forward, because that is, in fact, the heart of what matters here. Because belief is not just imagination, not the possibility to imagine, but it is, as Ashley Montagu said, that commitment to creating a reality. So let me use a few examples just very briefly. Richard Wrangham of Harvard has written a wonderfully enjoyable book about fire. I might disagree with certain points of it, but the basic theme that the capacity to develop, create, and deploy fire radically altered our niche. Not just in the obvious ways that I pointed out, but also in the experiential and perceptual, the ways in which we see the world. The idea that the day-night boundary no longer held for humans changes not just our activity patterns, actually changes our physiology, changes our sleeping patterns, changes the way in which our brains develop. And so that's a very general example, but that feedback from stone tools to iPhones all has that same pattern. Interestingly, we now have many, 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 many more things that are causing feedback. What that's doing, I think, in the next few decades is going to be the forefront of neurobiology. Did it turn off?
Yeah, thank you again for another splendid lecture. But I was intrigued by this idea of group compassion emerging. You know, that groups of hominins would provide care, long-term care, I suppose, for the incapacitated, the injured, the ill, the disabled, the aged. And it's not immediately obvious what advantages that would have for the group. Is it linked in some way to the longer nurture of the young? Or, I mean, what is the current thinking about it? This seems to be very distinctive for the human species.
It is, and it's fascinating, and I will keep this short because this is worthy of a full 6 lectures in and of itself, and I encourage everyone to read Penny Spickens and her colleagues' excellent work. I think what's really interesting is that we frequently ask the wrong question, because we ask, why would anyone do that? We have this notion that, well, really to model anything in an evolutionary sense, it's always individualistic, it's what raises my fitness or what's out. But the thing is, by this point in the human niche, the group, interacting, communal engagement was already set as a basal pattern. We don't have to explain why they cooperated and collaborated and taught one another. That's actually how they made it in the world. And so co-opting this broad-scale psychoneuroendocrine system of care for offspring that was shared across all groups, work by my colleague at Notre Dame, Lee Gettler, shows incredible caring response, physiological response in males as well as females. And I think we don't often remember that we're both the same species and geared towards care. If caring for everyone in the group and the reliance on others to care for you becomes a central facet of that niche, one could expect that risk-taking, risky decisions, exploration, and imagination are augmented, even if slightly. Now, most all human populations that ever lived have gone extinct, so it didn't work out for individual populations in most cases. But that capacity to be a little bit more secure in imagining possibilities that may not be evident from the material or experience at hand, because you knew you were cared for, might have in fact given our species, or the populations that eventually made up our species, a little extra edge. It's a debate. This is a hypothesis. But we know we did not get around by punching each other in the face all the time. So it's very interesting that we have this bias against compassion, when in fact, if we look at the fossil record right now, it's at least as important, or I would argue more important, early on than direct conflict.
Is there any anthropological consensus on the root cause of humans' unique capacity for technological innovation as distinct from analytical intelligence? So say, is it just like a latent within a high intelligence organism? So if a dolphin or something had equivalent capacity to manipulate matter, would it be equally, opposable thumbs or whatever, would it be equally technologically inventive, or is there something else? Thanks.
So that's a great question, and no, there is no consensus. But here I'll give you my opinion. As I said yesterday in the first lecture, if orcas, if killer whales had legs and thumbs, this would be a very different world. But it wouldn't be this world. What's particularly interesting about humans is that we are primates, and that comes with a suite of particular characteristics. And we are apes. We are part of the large hominoid group, which becomes with other particular characteristics. And we are hominins, which comes with other characteristics. So there's a bunch of very distinctive patterns and processes. Then we see this incredible augmentation in cognitive and neurobiological processes. And so I don't think it's that we're so smart, because frequently we are not. We have the capacity to be incredibly innovative, imaginative, and very wise. We don't use those all the time. So I think what's very interesting is, rather than looking at a trait, which is the way we usually talk about this, a particular technological intelligence or a particular manipulative intelligence, we need to look at the whole system. For example, New Caledonian crows are the sort of tool-using champions of, I think, the animal. I think they're amazing. They're absolutely incredible. They're corvids, who are incredibly, as a group, a type of birds that are very, very good at manipulation, very complex social lives. But these corvids, the New Caledonian crows, also are morphologically slightly distinct. That is, their eyes are a little bit more forward-facing, they do a little bit more, and so it's a constellation of traits, morphological, evolutionary, behavioral, and structural, that all coalesce. And in the case of humans, we're amazingly distinctive, and I would argue, fairly unlikely. So the bottom line is, if dolphins or orcas, blue whales or hyenas, had a different set of characteristics, we might be seeing very different worlds, but we would not be seeing the Playfair Library.
Thank you very much. A really fantastic lecture. I'm still amazed, even though I've heard some of this before. What you mentioned in passing the language as partly coming out of some of the tool-making activities, or somehow being predisposed to language. And I think a really interesting question is how language intersects or relates to symbolic thought, and the relationship between them, and what came first, and, if you like, the significance of language for our species, and some of the debates around that. Thank you.
I knew this was coming. I'm trying to hold off till lecture 4 to really tackle language. The most complex and probably most frustrating arena of human evolution is the evolution of language. I don't think we have really anywhere near the kind of good answers that we hopefully will eventually, or maybe we never will have. But I will say, as a prelude to forthcoming lectures, that of course we cannot even conceive of prelinguistic perception. It is impossible for us to do. And so the bias we have in interpreting the past record is that we are biasing it by words and semantic constructs and grammar. And I think language is so ubiquitously, not entangled, but causative, structurally formed in our senses, in our being, that it influences everything. How that came to be, I think, is very interesting. We won't know when language evolved per se, but let me put it this way. That 300 to 400,000 year time period, when a lot of things are going on, it's a couple 100,000 years in there. In that time period, we get 3 things happening. Contemporary brain size, but not connections, are reached. We know we have the vocal capacity for all the sounds necessary for language. And interesting, the inner ear structures that are ideal for hearing the frequency of human language form in those time periods. Does that mean, is that when language? Oh, and FOXP2 changes sort of occur in that time period, a particular gene that has to do with speech production. Do we have language then? I don't think we can ever know. Do we have evidence of meaning making? I will demonstrate in the next lectures that we do. And I think the ability to create meaning in complex ways that are not rooted in the material reality in front of you or your own individual experience necessitates some form of deeply rich, broadband communication that I would argue is the sort of baseline you need for language. But that baseline, I think, is pretty deep. And I think making those stone tools, even the early ones that none of you were interested in, the sort of sharp Oldowan tools, a round rock with some edges, even that rewires your brain just a little. And that rewiring in a recursive feedback context sets a cascade of effects that put us here today and allow us to have lectures like this.
I want to move things more from the descriptive to the normative. I wonder if the fact that humans have this specific human niche make humans somehow special. So obviously the famous philosopher Peter Singer makes the argument that, humans are cool, but like other animals also feel pain, feel joy in some ways. I wonder what your perspective is on shifting kind of your research into normative grounds.
So generally I avoid that, but I think it's important. So I will disagree with great respect with Peter Singer and others in some ways, because I think it's important from an evolutionary perspective when we think about whatever lineage, humans or others, what makes lineages distinctive is the stuff that happens since they're split with other organisms. So we share an enormous amount with other primates and with mammals and with chordates and a variety of other forms of life. That is critical, right? The fact that myself and a Chardonnay grape, right, share some 30% of our DNA, I think that's important, and that tells me something about my connectivity and responsibility to the world. However, I am interested in humans in this context. I'm actually interested in all primates, but in humans in this context. And I will say that humans are very distinctive in particular areas. I will not say, because data refute an argument that other animals don't feel pain, that they don't feel joy, that they don't feel something like love, that they don't have complex social lives, and that they don't suffer at our hands on a regular basis. But I will absolutely argue that there's something particularly distinctive about the human and the human niche that mandates a stronger look at those evolutionary processes if we are to construct robust, let's say, ethical and moral arguments about biology. I don't say that those come from biology. I think we construct them about biology. So it's very hard to make a normative statement here because it's so complicated. We are simultaneously continuous with the rest of life and yet discontinuous in very important ways. So to argue that humans are distinctive is also to argue that seagulls are distinctive, but they're distinctive in different ways. I actually happen to really like seagulls. Most people don't for some reason. But I think we need to value evolutionary processes. But in asking questions about the human, we have to understand that there's no other organism on the planet that arrests and deports people, right? That launches war, that has massive global inequality, and that engages in compassion and assistance at a broad scale. So there's something interesting about the humans, but humans are not the only important species. And in fact, I would argue sometimes other species need to take priority in particular contexts.
Is there any thought about the less amount of sexual dimorphism in our species compared to other apes that has formed the compassion and cooperation that has helped, or the kind of a feedback loop in either way? So what is the thought about that, please?
So that's something I didn't talk much about the morphology. Sexual dimorphism is differential size between males and females in a species. What's very interesting is that many of the apes, but not all, have fairly large sexual dimorphism. However, humans and chimpanzees aren't that sexually dimorphic. Yeah, and bonobos are, well, the bonobos and chimpanzees are about the same, slightly more than humans on average, but there's a lot of variation, about 10 to 15%. Now, what's interesting is that humans are dimorphic in weird ways. Our canine teeth are not dimorphic at all, but our body size is dimorphic. That is, humans don't fit the pattern of other dimorphic primates, right? And we're not very dimorphic. So what does human dimorphism mean? Well, that's hard to tell, because on average, big males and small females predict certain patterns of social behavior, but not always. And humans have a mix of all the patterns, sometimes of big male, small female groups, sometimes of monomorphic species, and sometimes of slightly dimorphic species. The bottom line is that intrasexual relationships, and I'm not even talking about gender yet, but intrasexual patterns and processes in humans are particularly distinctive and don't seem to map clearly to some patterns in primates or mammals. In some ways they do, but in other ways they don't. The problem is, it is impossible for us to talk about humans and sex without talking about gender. And so we have very, very complex relationships between males and females from very early on, even at a point where we might have had more sexual dimorphism. So in the human lineage, my guess is that the standard sort of patterns of primate sexual dimorphism and how they correlate to social behavior have been sort of disrupted and changed slightly. And so Sexual dimorphism in humans, I think, leads to or emerges from some slightly different patterns. Another final point, and probably no one cares about this, but it's very interesting. In the Miocene, 15, 12, 10 million years ago, there were lots and lots and lots of apes. When we talk about comparison to apes now, we talk about gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, gibbons, and humans. That's almost nothing. And so the actual diversity of body shape and form used to be much broader. And we make the mistake of comparing humans to extant apes without thinking about the diverse cluster of organisms that we actually all evolved from. And so I think dimorphism is a very interesting area, and it's somewhat untapped because we tend to look at other living forms when I think maybe some of the old Miocene apes are good places to look for dimorphism because the variation in patterns there is quite different. But that's paleoprimatology, and probably only a small percentage of people care about that. But you should, just like all the one-stone tools.
Well, I'm sure that all of us care a great deal about what you've been talking about, even if we don't all follow the details of paleontology. The larger ramifications are very, very clear. So I think we're going to bring this evening's activities to a close. Can I remind you again, the next lecture will be here at 5:30 on Thursday this week. Will you, again, join me in applauding our speaker for not only a fine lecture, but also for a gracious and informative way of handling the questions?